Welcome to the Weights and Plates podcast. I am Robert Santana. I am your host, along with Trent Jones, my co-host, and we have a guest.
We do.
Would you like to introduce her, Trent?
Sure. Well,
after you say yo, of course, your ceremonial yo.
Yeah, yo. We have a returning guest, actually, the one and only Stef Bradford from Wichita Falls, Texas. Stef, welcome to the
guys.
show.
It's good to be here.
Thanks.
Good to be back.
Thanks for joining us again. I'm going to be of no help in this episode because this one's out of my wheelhouse. But I'll be an interested bystander, and maybe I can crack a fart joke or something somewhere in there. I think today we wanted to talk about the science, right?
You got to do the echo thing, man.
The science.
Science.
The science.
TM.
TM.
Right?
TM.
Not actual science, but the.
That's right. The science.
Well, is it a trademark or a word mark?
That's an excellent question.
That's a Stef question. I actually learned the word mark from Stef.
I didn't even know. I don't even know what word mark is. That sounds like some made up shit.
Well, I mean, you can have a trademark can be an actual word and the font and how it's presented. So starting strength, for example, is a word mark. It's also copyrighted. I mean, there's all sorts of things that go together and are things that can get very technical. And mostly what they do is enrich people of a certain profession. It should be the legal profession. Yeah. So they'll get you chasing your tail in various things that aren't necessarily helpful. But,
So
just how it is.
So the starting strength logo, like you would see on the blue book, it's there's the trademark for the name starting strength, but also like the look of the font and the spacing and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So on the book the book's been around for a long time. That's not actually the word mark, but if you look at the modern font or the modern presentation, the way it is on the website, if you look at how it is on Strength Gyms, it's slightly different than the book cover. So the book cover was Adobe Garamond Pro, and the word mark is actually a specific font that has been modified slightly to make it even more, of a niche. But it's subtle things. Like you can see the difference, but a lot of people wouldn't notice.
Yeah. All right. Well, see, there you go. I'm learning stuff already, and we haven't even gotten to the main topic today. Well, I did have a question, a lead-off question before y'all get into it, because I know Santana, you've got a lot of things you want to cover today.
Sure.
But my question I wanted to lead off is, actually I have two questions. First of all, Stef, can you tell us a little bit about your background in academia? So I know you have a PhD, but I don't know what field that PhD is in and what your academic experience was and your education. So can you give us a little bit of background and what kind of research you've been involved with?
Yes, and I can try to do it in a way that's not horribly confused and boring.
Not over my head.
So, it's one of those things that I guess you could say I just kind of fell into. There are some people that get in academia because they've always wanted to be, a professor, a teacher, a researcher, something like that. That wasn't me. I just always have been interested in a lot of different things. And somewhere along the way, as an undergraduate, I started working in a lab just kind of as a side project. And I liked doing experiments. That was the hook. Okay. I liked doing experiments more than anything. And where I screwed up, actually looking back, hindsight is reveals your foolishness. Where I screwed up was I didn't understand that if I wanted to do experiments, I would have been better off to just start working in a lab, maybe get an MS, and work as a lab technician. And if I had done that, I might still be doing that today. But that's not what I did. Because I also always, was good at school, like a lot of us who end up in academia and, progressing farther along that kind of track. So, you're in there. I was on scholarship. And then with research, unlike, a lot of other fields, where people go to school, graduate school, they pay you. So everything's paid. So it's like, oh, cool, I can do experiments and they'll pay me and I'll do this stuff and it'll be fun and it'll be great. So I got hooked and I was doing that for a while. And really by the time I finished my PhD, I just didn't want to see any of those people ever again.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And the thing is, because you're focusing on the things you like, but like any job or anything you do, there's the things you like and there's all the shit that goes with it.
Yeah.
And what you find for a lot of things, you like parts of it, but you can't handle the rest of the shit that goes with it. And what I couldn't handle was the political atmosphere, the constant grant chasing, the entire bullshit, the focus on money. It was all about money, because you had to have money to work, to get the work done. So
it becomes
like,
the singular focus.
Yeah. And the higher up you go, the more you're just grant chasing and bullshitting and not doing the actual work and not doing the interesting, fun stuff. And then on top of that, the people that were like at the peak, like the lead researcher in a lab that had people under him, they tend to be complete dicks. Now, some of them are brilliant, right? But it's one of these situations where the guy at the top is milking off of the work that the underlings are doing. And so there's a lot of exploitation kind of thing going on. And that gets old. Even if you like the experiments, that gets old.
Yeah. And
I didn't tell you anything about the subjects. So, I mean, I did some random stuff like as an undergrad that all over the place. And then I ended up going to Duke University in their department of, what was it? Pharmacology and molecular cancer biology, which is a long name. So there you go. And what's hard to explain about this is that most of like cell biology, all this kind of departments, we think of these old things like biochemistry and pharmacology, but really everyone goes in and you work in a lab and it might be part of a certain department, but you borrow techniques and you work with people across different fields. So it kind of all cross-pollinates and gets all mixed up.
Sure.
But my subjects I was interested in were neuroscience-related topics. So I did things with proline transporter, high-affinity proline transporter, and then I went and I was looking at excitatory amino acid release. So I've done a lot of different things. Some of them well, some of them not so well. But that was my interest because I liked neuroscience, I liked the brain. And I liked a lot of the techniques that we used to study the problems that we were looking into at the time.
Sure. Yeah, and it seems like most people that I've talked to that have a PhD, this is a years long process, right? Do you remember how long it took you?
Forever, partly because I was in one lab and I was well along in my project. But the guy I was working with didn't make tenure, and he was a dick. The particular guy was a dick. But I really liked the subject. The subject material was very interesting. I had good people in the lab that I worked with other than him. And anyway, when he didn't make tenure, he just kind of like ran away and I had to stop and restart a completely new project. That was very exciting.
Oh man. Yeah. So that's probably, I'm imagining years of work that you have to redo. Yeah. Or, you're just doing it over. And I wasn't really efficient about anything anyway, too, because, I knew some people that went in, they were like, okay, I'm going to work with this guy. I want to get my PhD in this amount of time. So there were professors who had kind of projects set up that way. You could go in, you could get done in 4 years, 5 years, maybe. Yeah. Other ones where it was more interesting, was more experimental. Your projects might not work. And then you'd have to like figure something else out. That's kind of the kind of person I always pick the weird thing instead of the mainstream thing. That's just a horrible trait that I have in every single area. Well, I think so. I think there's a lot. There's a lot of gold to mine there, because I know you want to talk about a lot of the subjects that you've already brought up, Stef, during this episode. So, I have one other question I wanted to start with before we get into that, though, and that is it's kind of a dumb question, but I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts on this. What is science? Like what is, and I'm not talking about the science. Let's set that one aside for now. Set the trademark aside. So what is science? What is the field of science or the practice of science?
You're asking me or Santana?
I'm asking you. What? How would you
Me
describe
personally,
it? Yeah.
As I
man,
roll
it's
back in my
okay.
chair.
So when I don't have a definition like right here jumping out of my mind,
Sure.
then I'm not actually very good at articulating it. So, I'm not Rip. So I'm not as good at that as he is.
I
But
remember once you were telling me about that. You're like, I just call it the thingy.
yeah. I have a different kind of I have a holistic way of thinking of things. But okay, so there's some things that make up, science, that are essential to science. And I think they're things that people often put into them. Okay. And then Santana's going to jump in if I skip over something like a retarded person, which I probably will.
Oh no, you'll be fine.
But so essentially is the idea of observing, formulating a hypothesis, testing that, refining it, and repeating it. So the idea is, just at a very simple level, is we're going to play with stuff and we're going to test it and we're going to try to figure out what's going on. What's so disappointing about a lot of that is the failures due to the current setup, where it's basically a giant bureaucracy filled with people who are not at the core doing those things and are not concerned with uncovering truth about how things operate. Their motivations are different. They're different than that.
So it seems like the key there is it's observation based. It's about using our senses to observe the world and then form a hypothesis about why something might happen, and then go explore whether that's the case or not.
And then test it. So yeah, there's a lot of elements that go in there as far as like being objective, not making up data. It's like actual real data. Taking away biases in how you're observing and measuring things. Because the objective is to figure things out. It's to uncover the truth of how something's working and use that to make predictions, and then maybe build, things from there. That's what I found so interesting, because, I'm the kind of person that it takes everything apart. Sometimes I put it back together.
I think it's important to say that. I think it's important to say that because I think a lot of people's impression of what science is now, because of our current environment, is that science is this thing that a group of experts do, and it's this sort of consensus that a group of experts who are deemed scientists come to about why something happens or what you should do about X, Y, and Z thing. And that's like looking backwards at the the whole field of science, right? Because that's what it has evolved to be in our current world, but that's not what the basis of science is, right? The basis of science is more fundamental, like you just said, observation, hypothesis, testing. There's this bureaucracy that's built up around it, but I think a lot of people nowadays they confuse the two, right? They look at the bureaucracy and like, oh, well, that's science.
Yeah. Well, it's completely inverted. It's completely turned on its head. And people often give science the credit for something that's not science-based. And what I mean by that is, if you how it got to be over the last few years with this whole idiotic the science and the idea of consensus as equaling science, and peer review as being an essential facet of science, which is not the case at all. That's a very modern bureaucratic control the narrative type thing. Is they confuse engineering with science. Okay. Now, engineering, or like applying and building and making, that's like testing the real world by the application. That's how we get some cool stuff. Science is more why it's working. You don't need to know why it's working. And why it's working always follows. You don't figure out why it's working and then go, let's build a rocket. It's like you build a rocket and then you kind of figure out the real reason that, I don't always come up with the best examples, but you figure out like the real reason
that's a pretty good example.
The theory doesn't lead. The theory it follows.
Yeah. No, that makes sense, right? There was a friend of mine that was talking about some book. It was a series of lectures given in the 19th century by a famous scientist. I forget who his name was, but it was a lecture about the chemical composition of a candle. And it was just a great example because everybody's used a candle. It takes no scientific knowledge to light a candle and watch it burn. But the thing does burn, and there's you don't really know why, but it's actually kind of complicated. There's a lot of things that have to be correct for a candle to burn like it does. But okay, well, I'm glad we set that groundwork because I want to dig in now to like what the scientific process has become in the modern day, and this is where I leave it to y'all because you're the experts and have the experience in this field. But go for it. Go take over.
Okay. So while y'all were talking, I pulled up the Merriam-Webster definition of science.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Hit me.
We'll start there. So science, noun. There are two definitions, and it kind of goes into other context definitions in other contexts. So 1A, a knowledge or a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through the scientific method. Now I got to fucking define that shit.
Of course.
I know what it is. I just, it's what you said earlier.
Definitions are always hard because
I'm more on your end than Rip's. I like the second one better because it is a nice cop-out to that last sentence. It's, such knowledge or such a system of knowledge concerned with the physical world and its phenomena. So earlier I was listening to you talk, and you mentioned some of your projects. So there were two things I was thinking about. Number one, because people listening probably don't know the difference between these two terms. So I was going to ask you if it was more basic science versus applied science, and those things we can define. So that was my first question for you.
Yeah, it was basic science.
That's what I thought. So what is that?
Which means you're tinkering around. In fact, like a lot of times when you are talking about basic science, it's like you're kind of trying to figure out how to do something as you go along to figure out what you're looking at because you're not sure. Or to put it another way, like sometimes people ask me, well, what's this? What's it going to do? What's the ultimate purpose of this? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It depends what we find out here, because then there might change that here. And it could be related to this, but we don't know. If it is, that would be interesting, but not there yet. That's a big jump, and so on. So in many cases, you're looking at very basic processes. So you often in a very reduced system, you're testing just to try to figure out kind of what the general landscape is and then build slowly from there.
So to the average idiot out there, go ahead.
Nothing practical.
Nothing you would use in your room right now listening to us, right?
No.
To the listener or viewer, because we're on YouTube now.
So I mean, if like going into detail would kind of be hard. It would just get on and on. I haven't looked at it in quite some time. So I haven't looked at any of this in 20 years. So keep that in mind. But so for example, I was looking at the release of neurotransmitters. So I would set up a system. I would take animals and kill them, take their brains, do things to it, make a preparation, and then I would test that. I would put solutions on it, neurotoxins, and test in different A, B conditions and compare it and see how the release went, right? So, so you're using these tools, these neurotoxins, these drugs to try to differentiate what's controlling the release and what is actually released. Can you do anything with that? Not really. I mean, we're not talking about drugs you can give somebody. I mean, unless you really hated them, right? So like, botulinum toxin, you have to pretty much hate them to give them that. But, things like that are very far away from any kind of practical applied kind of situation.
So then why is it important? Because the stuff I did is obviously on the applied side. We'll jump into that, but I think this is important for people to understand because there's a big difference between what you're talking about and what I'm about to talk about. So I'm just kind of trying to segue into that.
Well, so that's a good question. So why is it important? So sometimes and I'm thinking of projects like a lot of different people I knew did. You're looking for different, like the more you know about this, the idea is the more you know about the background of how something works, especially if you think of some like a pharmaceutical kind of perspective. So you're thinking pharmacology, you're thinking drugs, you're thinking therapeutics at some point. If you know more about how the system's working, you can figure out potentially better targets to try to work on to do something useful, like maybe decrease seizures or something. It's a long way from any kind of application, though, because there's a million things in the way of that. So it's just kind of an idea of understanding more gives you more avenues and approaches to the problems you're trying to solve. A lot of it is just fiddling around in little circles because there's a lot of dead ends, right? Or things you thought were doing, but they turn out to be artifacts of some sort, right? So if you look at actual drug discovery and development, most of that is just a throw it at the wall, see what sticks. Throw it at the wall, see what sticks. Just high output screening of compounds from the environment and, generated chemicals, and just see, create assays and test for them. But let's say you wanted to have, like, you thinking, I'm looking for a drug that will do X, right? So, I mean, you kind of have to have an idea of wanting it to do X, and then make a little system that you can test 10,000 things at once in little tiny sample sizes. So you might use the basic to come up with a screening test, and then you do this high output assay that you just go out in a field literally and just pick plants and make little, extracts, and then put it on and see if it triggers the reaction you're looking for. And then you keep narrowing those down more and more and more and more to get something to use in a therapeutic setting. So a lot of that's been very much brute force, which is not what you think of when you think of somebody thinking and coming up with something smart and testing it and whatever. But there's so many options. You have to just start from things you can actually examine, things you can test, right? So,
yeah, it seems like to make a drug, I can imagine there is a lot of there's a lot of just like kind of throw darts at a dartboard and see what gets you the bullseye. But it seems like you need a huge volume of information, of knowledge rather, about basic processes of how things work in order to even start to create a drug. Well,
I mean, a lot of times it kind of goes the other way, though. The guy ate something, he threw up. Well, that's an interesting effect, right? So, it comes from observation over a long period of time. Where kind of some of the testing can be helpful is that you maybe can alter the drug and how it's metabolized to have less side effects, for example.
Sure.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Those kind of things. Yeah.
So the key feature here that I always think of when it comes to that sort of thing is there's a greater deal of control, right?
Sort of. I mean, a lot of those things, you're reducing the system so that you can test it. So you control the variables, so you can just test the thing you're interested in. But you never know about all the things you don't know about that are part of that test system.
Right.
A lot of times you find out later, like, oh, looky there.
So there's always a degree of unknown, no matter what you're doing. But in terms of your procedures and all the things you're manipulating, you have a greater deal of control than, say, something that's a little bit more practical.
Yeah, and not just practical, but you're taking it from a more, if you're in a very reduced system, you have a lot more control, right? And the further you go up into an actual mouse or a person or whatever, right? There's more stuff you don't know about.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly where I was kind of going with that. Should have had a second question. So there was that. Oh,
I'll tell you just a kind of background thing that I don't think people understand. So one of the biggest problems with modern science, like the way things are being done now, is it flip flops all over the place. I mean, how many times have you this thing's good, this thing's bad, this thing's good. So some people think the science of stuff is crazy or whatever, and they don't realize that the biggest thing that's probably missing right now other than people who won't, who are just pursuing things that are interesting because you get grants rather than actually being important.
Right.
Is that things aren't being reproduced. Right. So this is one of the key things.
Yeah.
See, the original idea is I do the experiment. Say I present this experiment. Santana goes and does the experiment. Does he get the same result? Right. No one repeats experiments. And I'll tell you, having had experience over the years, you'll have the methods in a paper and you're like, I want to use that same method in my lab and I want to use it for X, Y, and Z. I have never, ever been able to get a paper and do the experiment based on the information that's public, that's supposed to be there, so you can reproduce it. Something always goes horribly wrong. And so then people try to figure out, well, maybe I need the exact same reagents or this or that. You have to have the exact same reagents. Usually you have to go to that other lab, have them train you on to doing the procedure. And so you start to wonder, like, what is going on here? You start thinking, what don't we know about the exact situation that's creating this? Or like, I should be able to do the same thing and get the same results, but I'm not.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to dust off my, the 4 Greek words that I know, and I'm going to use 2 of them. So the Greek word for, I believe it's the Greek word for science. I think that's how it gets translated. I don't know the nuances there, but it's episteme, which is basically demonstrable knowledge. It's knowledge that can be, so if we take something that's a that's a law, a scientific law, like mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. If you don't believe me, I can always just show you. Like, here's one thing, here's another thing. You put them together, now we have 2 things. So 1 + 1 = 2. And if you're like, okay, I got it now, but then later on you're like, well, I don't know, maybe not. We can do it again. So we can reproduce that experiment that proves that proves the fundamental fact that 1 + 1 = 2. So there has to be some amount of demonstration there in order to actually prove that you've actually revealed anything, that you've uncovered any truth. So yeah, that's one of the things I've heard about is I've heard it referred to as the reproducibility crisis, and that when third parties go and try to test the methods, or I don't know exactly how they do this. I'd be curious how they do it. But when third parties go and evaluate how many papers have actually been successfully reproduced or been able to reproduce the results, it's a huge percentage of them that can't.
Right. And part of that, if you look at, if you pull up older papers, is they had this method section that's half the paper, right? So there's a lot of detail. Yep. So in modern ones where you pay to have it published, by the page, and they charge you to publish it, and they sell the journals too. It's been compressed, so there just isn't enough information. So it's like things probably get left out. It's more like a summary of what happened than the actual details.
Right.
And the data's not in there. So some things, I don't know about you guys, but when I'm figuring out something, I kind of think about it a little bit, I mess with it a little bit, and then I just go and do it when I half understand. And I figure out what I'm not understanding by kind of how it's turning out. So it's kind of like, I don't try to figure out all the theory and then go do it. I kind of read a little bit, then I jump in and do it, and I go, that didn't work, and I keep going from there. Well, you can't do that because you don't have the data. So people don't understand, when you have a paper, when you have something reported, the reviewers don't see the data. They see your summary of the data that you might have removed things from, that you're displaying in a certain way to kind of push the idea that you're kind of, drawing conclusions from, and all that kind of stuff. It's all in the presentation. They're not looking at the actual experiments. They're not looking at the data. They're not looking at the lab book. They're not looking at the trace off the HPLC. They are assuming and trusting that you are showing them your actual information. If it's something like a Western blot, so you're looking at, this protein separated out and identified or whatever, that you might have done 100 times, that you claim you've done 100 times. You're only showing them one representative sample. So they have to assume, they have to trust you, they have to believe that it's actually representative. It hasn't been altered in any way, it hasn't been photoshopped. that it isn't the one time you got it to work and it failed 20 other times. But guess what? All of those things happen, and they probably happen a lot more than you think.
So, yeah, this segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to touch on. So we've been really hitting on science up to this point, but there's another term that we're going to talk about in contrast to science that I learned from you and Rip years ago when you gave me that short little read called "Not Even Trying," and the book's called "Not Even Trying: The Corruption of Real Science." Do you remember the author, Steph? I do not remember the author.
Yeah, that's Bruce Charlton.
Yeah. So I was handed that by.
That's not
Steph.
Even his best book. He thinks a lot, and he puts out some really useful information.
It was a good introduction to this concept because he kind of highlighted things that I'd seen that you'd seen, and what I stole from it, that I continue to steal from it, is he differentiated science or scientists from professional researchers, or science from professional research, right? And we've up to this point we've been talking about science, right? And now I really want to get into the topic of professional research. So you mentioned something earlier, and I forgot what I wanted to ask you, but now I remembered. You said that your first advisor did not get tenure. A lot of our audience may have heard that term thrown around, but don't know what that means. And I have my own definition of it in my head, and I'm sure that yours is pretty similar. But I think we should start there because professional research, and we're going to touch on that. We really want to talk about the incentives behind why people conduct a lot of these studies now, and that's a big one. That's a big one to start with, I think.
So starting with the idea of tenure?
Yeah, let's start there, since you brought it up earlier.
So I don't know. It's like sometimes you look at this stuff and you're like, this is some sort of hazing system. But basically, if you go into academia, there's different levels of progression to, the little baby professor to the full-fledged professor. And if they decide they want to keep you on and make you totally part of the club in that institution, and you're not just going to be, replaced with somebody they like better. So they've accepted you. Your work's good enough. You're real serious quality. They'll give a person tenure, and in that place, it's basically now you're kind of locked in. So instead of having to get reelected every 2 years for the House of Representatives, you are in the Supreme Court. You're there till you
I like it.
Till you leave. Right. So it's the pressure. Think how different those two pressures are. Okay. Now, I mean, you probably want to think about them too much because thinking about politicians is painful. Thinking about judges and the insanity there is painful too. But you can see how that's a completely different environment to work in once you've been given the golden ticket, which is basically what tenure is. It's a golden ticket.
It's extremely difficult to fire these people. In many cases, and I don't know if this is state by state, but they're unionized too, which has another layer to that. But when you go take that a step further, when I was looking for an advisor, I learned the terms senior faculty and junior faculty. And I remember this one student talking to another student and said, never, ever take an advisor who is junior faculty because they want to get tenure and they're going to work the shit out of you and try to basically stretch the boundaries as much as possible because that's their incentive.
That's true. But they do a lot of cool stuff because what you tend to see is a lot of times the guys that are the up and coming guys, you have that balance. You want to have something new and exciting. So a lot of things they're doing are things that attract students because they're more like interesting problems. They're less established, right? So but the whole thing's more risky. So the project's more risky. Sometimes the people are crazier, Not that there's plenty of that goes on with the senior faculty, but it is a more stable situation where you'd be working.
Yeah,
I can see that was good advice. I probably wouldn't have taken it because I'm kind of done that way.
Yeah, I didn't. It was a mistake too.
Same thing.
We both got fucking half.
I got told by one. So the way they had it set up when you first went in, like the first year, you go to different labs and do some projects and kind of see like if you kind of like the lab environment and the professor there, all that kind of stuff. And I remember being told like, well, that'll be kind of a risky project. And I was like, oh, good. Because I'm that kind of person.
Same here. That's exactly what I was thinking.
So, Yeah, everything. I always get the weird thing if it's possible. So I probably wouldn't have listened. Um,
I
but,
started out with someone who was notorious for getting people out in 3 years. And she sticks it to me to this day. If I were to talk to her, she'd say, if you just listen to me, but you know what, 5.5, no, it was a 7-year stretch, 5.5, which were spent in the program. So I took 1.5 years off. But had I just stayed with her, but her projects were pretty easy, fast, quick, efficient. You learn enough. And, I kind of bought into the flashy stuff the other guy was doing, and man, was it.
Yeah.
I learned what not to, I learned what not to do.
Yeah, and it depends what your objective was. So I had one lab I went in. I did the project. It was great. I thought it was interesting. And then there was another girl that she had been just before me. She went back and stayed in that lab. And part of her goal was, I'm going to be done. I'm going to be out of here in 4 years. Like, it's guaranteed. It's not going to go a different way. I'm going to be done. I'm going to be completely done. And she was, and she got a job. And I don't know what she's doing. She probably is still working in some kind of research capacity. She was working for a company, but I don't know. But there were times where I looked at it and I was like, I could have done that too. That could have been me, But that's not the choice I made. So.
Me either. But I think we learned a lot, especially about human behavior and motivations behind why people do certain things. So to get tenure, as far as I remember, there were 3 things that they looked at. There was research activity, service, and teaching. And depending on the type of institution you're at, some of those things are weighed differently. I was at it sounds like, you definitely were too. We were at institutions that are considered high research activity, so that's weighed very heavily, right? The place where I got my master's was more of a teaching institution. They didn't have. I think they added 1 EDD at the very end, and we're not going to go into that. That's irrelevant. But it's a doctorate with some sort of research component involved in it. But for the most part, it was just all masters and nothing higher than that. And over there, it was weighed pretty low. Research was weighed pretty low. If somebody got dinged on research, the person in charge didn't like him and didn't want to give him tenure. I saw that happen once. And of course, the guy was good at what he did, of course, because it's typically how it goes in academia, sadly enough. But you're weighed on those 3 things. So they look at your teaching scores, they look at service you've done outside, and of course your research. So where I was at ASU was high research activity. You were at Duke, that's high research activity. So this kind of sets the tone for why these guys are motivated to do certain things. So when they're doing research, the lay public hears about studies that are published, and they assume that, first of all, they assume that the lead author, or I guess depending on the journal, but the guy in charge, we're just going to use that because the guy in because the first name could mean one thing in one journal, and the last name can mean one thing in another journal in terms of the order of the authors. So we're just going to say the guy in charge, right? They assume the guy in charge is sitting there in a lab coat with beakers doing the work, and that is not what he is doing. It's completely different, and I'll let you kind of describe that because I learned it from you. So I'm stealing information you taught me, and I started thinking about it. I started thinking backwards, retrospectively, like, oh yeah, everything she's saying is fucking true. That's exactly what they're doing. My summation of it was these guys are analogous to general contractors. They go, they get the money, they move to the next job, and they send a bunch of fucking skilled labor under them to do all the work. But that was my synopsis after taking in everything you said. So I'll let you kind of explain that system.
Yeah, I might have done a better job before than I will do today. But yeah, you can look at those guys as a GC or as a project manager. They just kind of coordinate things. But as far as the money goes, and this is the thing I think is the biggest problem, is these guys are selling whatever the researchers are doing. So it's basically almost even a marketing kind of capacity as far as what their role is. They're not actually doing research. With some exceptions where some will go in and do a little bit of it. What they're doing is they're getting grant money. And one reason these big institutions love that grant money is because that golden gravy flows to the institution itself. So professors aren't typically, I'm sure it varies in some places, but so if this guy is, Mr. Professor here, he gets the grant money. The grant money pays most of his salary. It pays for the building and all this kind of stuff. So these guys are supporting the institution by bringing in money. So this guy is like a fundraiser for the institution. He's fundraising for himself and his prestige. He's fundraising for the institution and all administrators. The money coming in here, it pays people in their employment. So, like for example, for me, it's like I had my tuition paid for. I got money every month, so it was a job. I didn't. So I had some people in some departments. Some friends of mine would also teach. I didn't teach. I just did research. I mean, I would teach some, new people in the lab or something. But as far as like classes, I wasn't teaching any kind of classes. I wasn't a teacher's assistant. I did lab work. I was just, the hired person. So they used the people, the up and coming people, to do all the work that's getting done. The other guys are running around schmoozing, making grant proposals to try to sound a certain way to sell the project they're doing here. To get money in here for this other stuff. Sometimes there's pilot studies you do with that money, like a slush fund, to get the next project. So here's this greatest idea, NIH, you need to fund it. You get the money, funds that project, but they also use it to try to figure out the next thing they're going to use to get money. So it's a giant fundraising operation is what it is. And it's extremely shitty. And what I mean by that is, so it gets very quickly driven by political funds, because it's like the NIH is, getting the money, it's like there's a lot of money in certain diseases, right? What's the popular disease right now, right? So it can be something that's completely overfunded, like breast cancer. Sorry, completely overfunded. Other things that got popular at different times. So there's just a lot of money thrown at them, things like HIV. It's great and all. But, it's because the money's there for political reasons. It also, there's a lot of intersections with drug companies as well, right? Where money's coming in from drug company grants. And, I'm sure you guys see where someone might criticize, oh, this study came out of Pfizer, so we can't trust it because it's a drug company. Or this study was funded by ExxonMobil,
Right.
So
Right.
whatever it is corrupted. Guess what, guys? NIH is political. And getting funding from government is just from a different entity that people are.
That's right.
Producing. They're whores, guys. I mean, they're producing stuff to get money. That's what they're doing. And depending what the politics are, it's corrupted because the answer they want to get. And it doesn't have to be as obvious as say, oh, Exxon, oil, fine, whatever. But you know what? These guys want something too. They want things to go a certain way.
Yeah,
So,
if you had asked me 5-6 years ago about this, I would have. I guess I had this naive idea that if you were a scientist, if you were a researcher, that you had you just had a topic of interest and you just would go explore that. And, you would find different avenues to explore that question. And that's it. That's sort of, it's all driven by, by your own desires and interests and what you want to study. And I mean, that looking back, that's an incredibly naive way to look at science because, it's like somebody's got to pay for all these labs and carrying out all these experiments. And so the flow of the money, you can see how there's a lot of pressure to produce, to study certain questions so other questions don't get explored, don't get studied. And then, to produce certain results that are favorable, that'll get you the next grant. But I guess I just never even thought about it before. I don't think many people do think about this.
And the thing is, that's not like new, okay? But it's on a larger scale. So if you think back, hundreds of years ago when these, some of these pioneers in various fields were operating, and you think of that as kind of the golden age, in some ways it was, because when there's less money in it, you get people that are there for things other than money, but you still had to have a patron. Same way they did with arts, right? It's like, you had to play the game because money had to come from somewhere, there's certain things you can kind of do on your own, certain kind of observational or, exploratory things, but people had to get money to fund their expeditions or their experiments. It had to come from somewhere. So there always was that kind of pressure. So you might ask well, what's different? And the more you take something to the masses, the worse it's going to get, right? Because you're going to get more people there just for the money. And because of the way the system works itself by creating a bureaucracy, that stifles everything that goes on, right? It's a lot more restrictive. Because now, because why? Because people are coming for the money, you're attracting a lower quality of people at that point. And we see this in kind of anything, right? If you start scaling, you start getting, if something gets popular, it starts getting crappy, right? It doesn't get wonderful, right? There's a certain leading edge where it's great. And then it's like, oh, now everyone's doing it and it sucks. Why? Because, you're regressing to the mean, right?
Yeah. Like how many, how many premier research institutions are there for any given, scientific question? And if are there 50 universities that are just like the premier, university for studying, this particular cancer question? I would kind of doubt it, but there might be 50 universities chasing that grant money, or 5,000. I don't even know how many, the scale of what we're talking about. But yeah, that certainly makes sense. That if you have this huge incentive to chase grant money, then you're going to get a lot of players in the field, some of whom are just. It's just totally different caliber of talent there.
Oh. Yeah, and you just get more people that are there to play the game versus to do it for real. I mean, it's kind of like how Google will periodically change certain things that have to do with rankings or something like that. It's because what happens when they figure out how you're doing the rankings, then people start gaming the rankings. So then you have to change them. And it just keeps going and going. But when something has a lot of bureaucratic structure, you can't keep changing. You know what I'm saying? It's now people are playing a game because that's what's there now. It's a game.
Right. And I think that's probably where we get, we get the absurdities that start to happen. Like I've heard about these people who will submit sham papers to journals for peer review.
You hear about people that have gotten caught submitting sham papers.
There's people that have gotten caught, and there are teams that have intentionally submitted bogus research papers to journals to see how many how many journals admitted them, and so there's people that have just totally falsified results, and they're supposed to go into a peer reviewed journal, but they get published anyway because there is no peer review.
No,
it's just some guy slapping his name on the.
or there's not as much information in the paper as you think. You know what I'm saying? It's like this looks. Sure. Think of the problem. So if you have you're studying like I don't know nose hair or something, right? So and everything gets more specialized, right? So now you're the nose hair expert. Okay, so you have a paper on nose hair. Well, who's the peer? Well, it's the other people studying nose hair. Well, who are they? They're your competitors. You know what I mean? Yeah. So they can mess you up, or it can be hey, now I'm going to let your paper go in, and then pretty soon mine's coming up. You know what I mean? You also have people turning in their papers, and all of a sudden, while their paper's being held up, somebody else produces something very similar. So there's a lot of. It's like part of the game. It's part of the competitive environment. For the purpose of doing what? Winning, right? Getting the prestige, getting the money, getting the tenure position, having little people do your bidding that you can treat badly. All that fun stuff.
And I've learned from our friend Dr. Pewter that if you can get to the point where you're the guy writing the textbook for like an undergraduate course, I mean that's big money. You start getting textbook royalties. So there's a lot at stake here for sure. So
there's the textbooks and there's the patents and stuff too. So there's a lot of things that are patented. Now you think, well, wait a minute, you did this on let's say a NIH grant, funded this thing. Why should you get the money and not like the government? Well, right. You grease the right hands, you get to keep the patent. That's how it works.
Okay.
To be cynical, but I am very.
Yeah.
And the house always wins anyway, so. So this comes back to a broader point I wanted to touch on. In research, they talk, when we were doing it, talk about and we're required to address assumptions and limitations in our studies. And I like those two words because they tie into things that people take for granted, right? So we're going to define these as best we can. So an assumption is typically something that's, accepted as true or plausible. We're just going to leave it there. That's where we'll draw the line, right? So you just assume that something's, working the way it should, or, I'll give some specific examples in a second because I'm going somewhere with that. A limitation is something that you just have no control over for various reasons. An instrument might be limited to, certain functions, or you might not have enough money to control for certain things, right? Those are limits of your study. Well, nobody ever thinks beyond the study itself, right? There's a big, giant assumption in professional research, and that is that a scientist is somehow more honest than a non-scientist. That's a big one, right? Because the guy's still a fucking human, right? But you are making that assumption when you take research, or the famous phrase studies say, at face value, right? And people don't stop to think, and this is it's a point I'm going to hit on at the coaches conference this weekend, and that I may have hit on this show before. I'm not sure. I've been kind of like delayed really talking about this publicly for a while. I had to, be out of school for enough time to, get over that PTSD. But that's a big assumption. You're assuming that a scientist or a professional researcher, we're just going to call them what they are. We're assuming that a professional researcher is more honest than the average person, right? That's a big fucking assumption. And then when it comes down to the publication process, people forget you are reading a self-report. Let that digest for a second. Some of y'all listening that are familiar with research papers, a peer-reviewed article is a self-report. What is being reviewed? What's being reviewed is a written account of what somebody told somebody else happened. So you're playing a game of telephone here. No matter how you want to spin that, that is what it is. So it's a big fucking assumption, right? So you're assuming that what was written reflects what happened. That's a big assumption right there. You're also assuming that the person who reviewed it accepted it as is, that nothing was modified, because if things were modified at the behest of the reviewer, that's not going to be reported, right? So you have those assumptions, right? And you're also assuming that everybody who participated in the study was skilled, experienced, and had knowledge to do what they were doing. That's another big assumption, right? Because what about these low budget studies, right? That have a bunch of master's students, who trained them, right? The doc student who got trained by who? The other doc student? Kind of like we used to talk about. First coach I met, strength coach I met, was actually a professor at this institution I did my undergraduate at, Western Illinois University. If you're ever in Macomb, Illinois, Tim Piper, good guy. He supports our stuff. And I remember when I told him I found Starting Strength, he said, good book. So that was the first time I went to a gym, similar decor to Rips, lots of old pictures of meets and stuff. It was my first time in that environment. He taught me how to lift. And the joke he always had was about lifting technique, right? He's like, the senior teaches the freshman who becomes a senior and teaches the next freshman. So they're all learning from the senior, right? Sad to say this, I would say, and Stef, you can speak on this too. I think a lot of this happens in academia a lot of the time, but I don't know. I've only been to like 2 or 3 institutions, and certainly not at the caliber of the one that you went to. So that's a big one, So you got a lot of the blind leading the blind in a lot of these places. So a lot of people don't know that, right? Like how do they get people to carry out some of these techniques? Sometimes if they have enough money, they might hire somebody with expertise. They might hire, a technician that's done it for a living and has done thousands upon thousands of procedures, or they might have students teaching students, which is what I saw, right? But again, you're making a lot of assumptions about human behavior, and there is no audit of the work. Nobody's showing up at these labs. Like the NIH gives us money. They're not sending people over there to spy on them and see if they're doing what they say they're doing. The assumption is that they are doing exactly what they say they're going to do, and that they're going to report it honestly, and that the reviewers are going to accept it as is and only, check for fucking, non-technical related stuff, right? And that the media is going to report it honestly too. Let's not forget that, because where do people learn about research? They learn about it on Instagram, social media, New York Times, etc. So lots of assumptions about human behavior that people don't even consider in all this, right? And that's not to say 100% of it's dishonest, but that is to say that it's probably safe to assume that a good chunk of it probably is, especially when you're dealing, which you said earlier, you got more and more people involved, right? How many institutions do we have? How many researchers per institution? You're talking about thousands upon thousands at this point, right? And
right.
I think that's, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so this is one of these things, and this came up with this, ridiculous stuff that's gone on over the last several years with, the COVID lies and things that happened with that. So people a lot of times will be like, well, why would somebody lie? Or, they're looking for motivation. Guys, like, take a good look at yourself. So first of all, I mean, there's times when you outright lie. When do you lie? Because a lot of times they're, little lies, but it's convenient for you for whatever reason. Or you just say something to make yourself more, they're kind of small things. You say something to make something more interesting. It's very easy to cut corner kind of lying. And that's a lot of the stuff that goes on here. So when we say dishonesty, we're not talking about somebody sitting in a room with Satan making plans.
Yeah, okay? That's right.
we're talking about somebody who it's more convenient for them to do this. It gives them some benefit to turn this in. They go along with something instead of calling it out when they see something. People do stuff that's convenient for them. They don't. I had this conversation with a guy who lost a job, and he was all upset about what had happened and how it had been handled. And I said, they got rid of you because you weren't convenient for them. It wasn't worth it. I mean, it wasn't about what you did or didn't do. They just wanted you gone, right? It's the same kind of thing here. So a lot of things that happen, it's like, it's convenient for somebody. They want to keep their job. What do they do when the guy over them wants them to do something? They just go, okay, I didn't see it. I didn't see anything. They're not going to call it out and lose their job. I mean, some people will, but guess what? They're not in those positions for very long. There's just 1,000 compromising things that happen all the time, and you do them too. Because everyone figures out ways to excuse their behavior, right? To rationalize it. You do what you want, what's convenient for whatever reason right then. And then you find a way to say it's okay. Now, the thing is, the assumption people have, though, is this is like some sort of like pureness. This is the pure ivory tower thing. These people are in search of truth. Guys, even when you're in search of truth or trying to do the right thing and be honorable, it's tough, right? Because we're people, like Santana says. But I think a lot of them aren't really trying to pursue that, Like we think classically, oh, you want to, the science is about the pursuit of truth. It's like, we're talking about people. They're like postmodernists. They don't believe in truth anymore,
Yeah.
It doesn't even apply to them. It's like what's good for you, and it's my truth and your truth. It's like, have somebody who says something like my truth be a scientist. It's like, well, I think there's a fundamental conflict right there. They don't 100%. Actually believe in truth. It's kind of hard to not lie constantly, which is already something that we're susceptible to doing, right? So it's like, guys, people suck, and
we're not
some
skeptics
societies have been better over time. What else has changed with the bureaucracy getting larger and larger with science and the money getting bigger and bigger? Well, what's changed is we've gone from a bunch of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants to a bunch of atheists who don't believe in truth. Now, that fundamentally, I'm saying, don't have a fundamental, the same kind of fundamental association with truth as a fundamental reality.
Right.
We have people that are relativists. It's like, obviously you're going to have problems.
Yes.
Guys.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's even, I can think like on a more mundane level, I can imagine if you're looking at test results and, like you said at the beginning of the show, you go down all of these little avenues of tests and tests and tests, and they all turn up negative, right? They're no, that's not right. That's not right. That's not right. You need to reformulate our hypothesis. That's not right. And maybe this takes years. I can imagine there's an enormous amount of pressure to produce something, even though that's good science, as we described at the beginning of the show. That doesn't. I can't imagine that looks good when you're in a panel of your peers and you're going to, present at symposiums or whatever. It's just like, well, I tried 100 things and they all failed. Versus having a breakthrough,
So the thing is, they don't want to publish negative results, but negative results, like you point out, the things that don't work are information that are actually, that's like really actually very important.
Sure.
But they don't want to put it there. And then going along with that, when you come back to the dishonesty, it's what I call the cop problem. Okay. So, when a cop knows you're guilty, guess what you are? You're guilty, right?
Right.
So it's like, I know you're guilty, why'd you plant the drugs on him? Because he was using drugs. So obviously, you know what I'm saying? It's like you're setting up a situation you believe to be correct. Well, if you believe in your, this idea you have as being the explanation, you find ways to keep believing it. So it's like you look at certain things, you interpret it certain ways. It's like you're not really even trying to be bad, but that's what people do, and they double down and over and over keep going with it. Instead of considering that maybe their basic assumptions were not correct, maybe something's wrong with their experiment. They've invested their time, their ego in it,
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, and I imagine some people here are going to say, well, but we have ways of controlling for bias in research, right? We have random sampling, right?
Oh yeah. do we want to jump into that?
Well, yeah, sure. You've talked about this on the show a few times, Santana.
I go off about this a lot. So the type of research that I was involved in was applied research because it was based upon what I do now. I wanted to learn more about that, and I thought the good old ivory tower would teach me something. And I came into the industry as a professional. I've been training people for at some capacity for over 20 years, but I started working about 14 years ago, right? And there were two things that were dominating the industry. One was this corrective exercise, fake physical therapy bullshit that doesn't seem to fucking die. And two was citations, were starting to circulate, and then all of a sudden, guys that, claim to be gym trainers or strength coaches or bodybuilding coaches or whatever the fuck suddenly have, PhD or DO or MD next to their name, suddenly everybody's a doctor, and DPT, I guess. So, I thought, as a self-employed person, I'm like, well, to be competitive in this shit, I need to do that too, and because I need to understand this because people keep asking about it. Now that I'm older, I look back and I'm like, I was just in a fucking bubble because most people don't give a flying fuck about this shit. And the people that do, I don't really want to do business with a lot of them because of what I'm about to talk about now. So when you start getting into human subjects research, which is applied science at its finest, you have a couple of problems that you run into. There's guys on the internet that will, sit there and tout randomized controlled trials, right? And this is considered the gold standard for conducting research. So let me just define a few things here. So you got a couple different types of research. You have experimental research, which I'll define that in a second. You have observational research. Observational research is your epidemiology, your correlations, where they'll, look at things at a single time point, or they'll look at mass population data and look at relationships between it. And you can't really derive a cause and effect relationship from that. So for those of you who've heard correlation is not causation, that's where it comes from. You're just basically gathering data from, in this case, a bunch of people on, let's say, a particular outcome, right? Look at strength levels, right? So you might look at strength levels, but then you might measure other things, right? Like body weight, right? So it's a good one for this audience, right? So you might measure somebody's bench press and then measure their body weight, and then you might do that with 10,000 people, right? And then you'll look at relationships, right, between body weight and bench press, right? Bigger bench press, bigger body weight. I don't have to pull a citation for that. That's probably true. But, that's your classic observational research. And they have quasi-experimental research, which falls into that observation umbrella, where you might assign people to groups, but it's not random. You might have volunteers, say, I'm going to throw you in a lifting group, and I'm going to throw you in a control group where you sit on your ass eating Cheetos, right? And I'm oversimplifying here. I'm not going to go into any specific design when I'm defining this, but that's non-experimental research. So they call that quasi-experimental. Then you have your experimental research, and what makes a research study experimental is the random assignment of people to treatment and controls, right? So the reason you're going to use something, so I'll go into random sampling next, but random assignment pretty much allows you to understand or allows you to infer whether any effect that took place was because of the treatment, right? So if you had somebody lift and somebody not lift and they gained muscle mass, you can be confident that the group that didn't lift or that did lift put on the muscle because they lifted, right? Because you randomly assign people, they have an equal chance of being in either group, right? So you're washing out any bias there, right? But then, can you generalize that? Nobody ever thinks about this, right? So they always talk about the randomized control trial, and then they try to say, well, look what this study found. And they used the gold standard. Therefore, you should take this conclusion at face value and, apply it to your own life. I mean, they may not say it like that, but that's kind of what's inferred, right? That this happened in a lab by scientists. Therefore, it's science, and you should apply this, right? Like your bench press and a stability ball bullshit. I don't know if they randomly assign there, but all the random assignment tells you is that the treatment or intervention probably was the cause of whatever effect was measured, right? It does not tell you what would happen in a broader population. So let's say that you're studying men in my neighborhood and you get people to volunteer and you randomly assign them to a control group or a training group, right? If they improve, you can be confident that it was because of the training, right? But you can't say that every single person in the neighborhood or the majority of people in the neighborhood are going to benefit from this because these people volunteered. So I always say if you want to generalize your findings, you have to sample randomly. So what that would look like is, theoretically, because we don't do this, you'd flip a coin, and based on that coin toss, you determine which address is going to be hit up to pull a participant in, right? And then you get a random sample of, let's say that there's 1,000 people in the neighborhood. You get a random sample of 100, right? You have 10% of the population, right? And I'm just pulling shit out of my ass. So that I don't know if that number is correct or incorrect. I'm just trying to use some easy round numbers here, right? So you got 10% of the population of people in this neighborhood, and you randomly sampled them, right? So everybody in the neighborhood, because you used every address in that zip code, everybody in that neighborhood had an equal chance of being in the study. Then you randomly assign, you conduct the study. Now you can generalize because the people who didn't participate had the same chance to be in the study as the people that did participate. When you use volunteers, you don't have that. So now you got people that are interested, right? How are they? Are they different than people that are not interested? What about people that are not interested, right? So that's like, one basic question of that, right? So you can only generalize if you randomly sample. Now, what a professional researcher or a wannabe professional researcher on Instagram might say to you is, well, you just recruit enough subjects. Well, who decides what's enough subjects? Well, the next answer they'll give you is, well, look at previous research. Okay, well, how did they decide? Well, they looked at previous research and they looked at previous research. That's problem number one. They're just this pyramid scheme at this point. You're going back to all these other studies that decided on this number based on what some other guy decided on, right? But then is the number even big enough from a practical standpoint, right? So I don't want to turn this into a whole big COVID episode. We're not going there, but I looked at the COVID data, and the number of Americans in the Pfizer trial was 14,000. The total sample was 40,000, right? So you had 14,000 volunteers that were American. We're going to set aside that the United States of America is a heterogeneous population. So we have lots of different ethnicities spread out across this country, different by state, different by city, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, versus, a country like China where I had to look this up for something I was writing in my PhD, actually. I think 99% of them are Chinese. It's definitely over 90%, right? So that's a homogenous population. But let's set that aside for this argument. So you have 14,000 participants from this country. That's not even 1% of the population. So you've studied this vaccine on a fraction of 1% of the population. And I'm not, confirming or denying the vaccine. I want to kicked off fucking YouTube here, but I'm just talking about the stats here, right? We got 14,000 Americans. So 14,000 people in a country of 360 million people. Now, I'm not going to quote media because, I can say one thing and they can say, well, that's not exactly what I said. The inference was that every single American should take this thing. I mean, I'm sure that's not exactly what was said, but that's kind of what was suggested. Can you really conclude something like that off a fraction of the percent of the population? Because 14,000 sounds like a big number, but not in the context of 330 million, right? So I always say that. Do we ever have enough subjects? Because a lot of these studies never even touch a 0.5% probably, when you're looking at these controlled trials. But then you go back to assumptions, right? Let's say that you get 1% of the population, right? So what is that? 3.3 million? Is that right? So you get 3.3 million people. How many humans do you have to hire to carry that out? And then are you going to spread these people across the nation? We're just, fucking, we're in fantasy land here, obviously. We're not going to do this, but let's say you had 3.3 million Americans spread across the 50 states, right? Well, now you got different people in different states carrying out different tests, and then you got different, different environmental factors. But the main thing that I want to hit on there is you have a lot of people you have to control, right? And as we talked about earlier, once you start scaling shit, things just get shittier, right? Because, it just gets harder and harder to control human behavior, especially, I will say, as the skill level of the thing you're trying to do gets higher. You can't scale something like that, right? So how do you monitor, test, assess, carry out an intervention on 3.3 million fucking people, right? You can't. So, typically you're not going to do something like that. You might look at smaller populations, but even then, you start looking at this data, like they'll say, oh, this study is on women. Well, that's half the fucking population, right? You're still not going to touch 1%. I don't even know if you'll touch 0.5%. So is it ever enough subjects to override the need to randomly sample to give your population an equal chance of being in the study? I would say probably fucking not, without having read every single fucking study in PubMed. Probably not, But yet, when you start looking on social media in this business, because I want to keep it to this business, you start looking on social media, they'll say, oh, look, this weird angled bicep curl works better to grow your arm because these scientists did a study where they did sets of 30 and God knows what else on, 100 subjects, a whole 100. 100's a lot of people, And then it's like, what the fuck? There's, what is there, like 4 billion females in the, we're talking, I said females earlier, that was the example I used. So what, we got 4 billion females on the planet? Like what women, what country, what state, province, etc., what city, what neighborhood, what are those things they call, and now I'm using your word, Steph, the thingy, when you're looking at zoning, they have like little quadrants for neighborhoods. I forgot the name of it. There's a word.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So, so that's true. Right. So the idea with a random sample is that the samples are not going to be biased, but it still doesn't mean the samples are the same. Right. But the thing is, you run into other problems if the samples are the same. So, there's a lot of, things that have happened over the years that, nobody talks about unless you're in the particular area of research, and you can start to see some of these problems. So back at 1900s, around there, for some bizarre reason, don't ask me why, I wasn't there, not quite that old. People had this hobby. It was popular to have mouse colonies. People would breed mice, which sounds like really not interesting to me. But anyway, so, this was like a thing people did. And so over time, people would develop their little strains, and breeding and breeding and breeding. What do you get? You essentially get clones. You get a homogeneous population. So there have been these mouse strains that have been around. And then, of course, they got used for research studies, because then it's like, okay, cool. Now we have basically identical animals in group A and group B. So now when we don't have this sampling problem he's talking about. We have identical animals. Well, the problem is when you go to extrapolate out, you find that, well, that's true, but the effects in one population, these little black mice over here, very well are different from these little white mice. And so sometimes you're not going to see an effect, because let's say you're doing something that you're trying to see, can the mouse learn? Okay. And you give them a task and, some silly thing in a maze or whatever, right, where the mouse is learning. Well, what happens if you're running your test on the stupid mice? It takes a while to figure out that they're the stupid mice, right? So the stupid mice, the effect is so small because they're just not good at learning. You can't find the effect. If you're testing a drug, you can't find the drug that changes their ability to do whatever it is, because you're missing. You're just missing because you're looking in a group that's the same. There's also been cases where researchers thought they were working with the same animal, but they weren't, because what happens
Right.
sometimes in a population? You get a mutation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Right.
So we had cases with rats where it was the same rat, but the rat from this company that provided the animals grew twice as fast and grew almost twice as big as the same animal from the other companies that had that same, you see my little air quotes here, the same rat. And so you're like, well, how can I compare them? You know,
Right.
It's not the same. You think they're the same, they're not. And then they're not the same, because the population being this clone restricts what you can extrapolate to the other populations, or like mice as a
still
whole,
a
or
business.
people, or whatever the heck you're trying to take it to. So no matter what you're doing, there's always, it's very easy to be wrong. And there's 100,000 different ways to be wrong.
And I can
It's a lot
imagine
harder to be right.
the lead author in the study is like, hey, listen, we've already spent $15,000 on rats. Like, you're going to use that rat. Like, you know, just say it's the same rat. We don't have the budget for more
labs.
rats.
What would happen is labs using that one rat would stay with that, because now they're comparing their studies over time. They're, at least it's the same rat, sort of. Maybe, who knows?
Right. Yeah.
Who knows what other things we don't know have changed
Like the
that weren't so
reactions to
damn obvious, because, you know, you can see like, why is it so big? I thought, you know, the age is the same, right?
Okay.
So there's just so many things you don't know. You're like, well, what are you feeding your rat versus my rat? Right?
Right.
One of the big things is with animals is the reaction to men versus women. Have you guys run into that? So let's say you're working at a lab. You got a new job.
sexist.
You have to go in and count mouse poops. Cut off the tails for DNA samples, whatever you're doing, right? So you're the guy that's doing the experiments. You're the poor little graduate student. And so you got the worst job. You got to go in there in the middle of the night and do these things with these mice or rats or whatever. You know what? You know what stresses animals out differently is when you do it versus me. You know why? Because you're a boy and I'm a girl. Yeah. So now imagine if your lab was studying like stress responses in animals. Oh man.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
How much of this cortisol response that we were measuring had to do with the fact that the guy dealing with animals were dudes, and the animals go, this is a male on alert, versus the female where they're like, yeah, whatever, you know? And of course, people in, let's say, they're working with stress response, working the HPA axis, cortisol, all that stuff. They're like, okay, I don't know what we're going to do, but they're at least aware of the problem. What about the people that don't realize that their animals are being stressed and it may be affecting their experiment, but they don't know it because they're not really thinking about stress, because that's not what they're really trying to test for. They're doing something else.
I mean, that's what I say, but then you get a lot of guys that read all this weird bullshit, you know, it'll say that science says, or research says, or so-and-so said that research says, that, you know, we need to do a bunch of light weights for high reps because that is the science, and that's what gets you hypertrophy, right? And it's like one of our favorite words to shit on here. It's unfortunate because it's, you know, it's a scientific word, you know, it's the enlargement of muscle mass, but it's come to mean that you have to do this weird type of training that is typically done by fucking drug addicts that like to do these quasi-beauty contests to impress other drug addicts. And now the lay public thinks they need to do, you know, some weird angled fucking super isolated exercise for sets of 30 and, you know, keep track of the number of sets they do instead of the amount of weight they're lifting. Because that's what science says. I used to say this, I thought I might tone it down for the episode, but I'm not going to. You know, I said this about scientists, but I'm going to include these people that are disseminators of science, you know. They may or may not have a PhD that they've never used, which I do have a PhD I've never used. You know, I mean, I've got it and I do this for a living, so I'm not hating on that. But, you know, I also don't call myself a fucking scientist. You know, I've authored some articles, so I guess I'm an author too. And, you know, I do this podcast episode, but I don't sit here and say I am a scientist, and I don't deconstruct papers because I just explained to you the structure of the situation, and I think it's a giant waste of time to deconstruct papers. Like, when I see these fucking reels pop up and these dumbasses saying, so-and-so made this claim, and sometimes the claim is obviously fraudulent and stupid, but sometimes half of what the guy's saying is probably true, and they'll say, well, look what the research says. And I'm like, you just discredited this bullshitter with this bullshitter, like they're both full of shit sometimes, like I've seen that happen many times. But when the whole thing doesn't do what it purports to do, professional research doesn't answer questions about what the fuck you should be doing in your daily life in many cases. Sometimes they get it right, Like, there's meta-analyses out there that say that if you add weight to the fucking bar, you're going to grow no matter what the rep range is. That seems pretty plausible. But then, meanwhile, these guys will ignore that part, the no matter what rep range you do, and tell you to do sets of 30. And then ignore the part where the sets of 30 were cable bicep curls or knee extensions or something, some single joint exercise that makes sense to be done at a rep count that high. They're not squatting. They're not deadlifting. They're not bench pressing. They're not pressing. And they're not doing chins or anything like that, but they like to leave out the details because, again, marketing. So let me get back, and not escaping what I said I was going to say. The way I've described these people, and if you want to build on this, Steph or Trent, you can, but when I talk to the lay person about a professional researcher, I say they are used car salesmen with extensive vocabularies.
Yeah. And I kind of want to tie into what you were saying there, talking about, some of the problems. The biggest problem when you start taking things over to training, which is what we do, is none of these studies. The sample sizes have problems. The methods have problems. The things they're measuring have problems. The retarded exercises have problems. But even if those things didn't, the study is this long. It's short, super, super micro short, We don't want micro things.
You can't generalize any of it.
And you're talking about something that extends over a period of time. So it's like your information is just, it's irrelevant because it's such a short-term thing. So even when you're just talking about this and talking about the increasing the load, so you're progressing the load, you get the results, doesn't matter the rep range. What matters is if you're doing that 30 rep range, are you able to progress load? So if you're looking at the thing over the time, what you would find is that, okay, sure, do your 30, whatever the heck it is, and you think it's going to help you. But then what you find is you can't keep progressing the load using that rep range. So it's like you just did it for a while instead of like try to figure it out and be super smart boy and skip the steps, and you actually lived it. You actually went in and trained in the gym and you increased the weight on the bar, and over time you saw your progress go up. You'd learn a lot. Sometimes Rip will say something like someone will post something on the board about this XY guy does this and thinks this and he disagrees or whatever. And it's like, well, when you deadlift X amount, and with Rip, it changes different times. But let's say this: when you deadlift over 600, you get to have an opinion. Until you haven't done it, you need to shut up and just add weight to the bar, right? You don't need the fancy stuff. You need to actually develop some expertise, which you don't have. And it's expertise not in what you're thinking about doing, what you're planning out, and all your best ideas about the best way. It's the expertise that develops from actually having your feet in the gym, the bar on top of your back, and you're actually doing performance. And that just takes time. It takes putting in the work. Thinking about things and arguing on the internet is great if you want to do it. I have a limited tolerance for these things. But it's like, well, go to the gym. What are you doing in the gym? Right? Now it's complicated by the drug picture. So there's a lot of people that, start out with pretty good genetics. They pile on the drugs. And unfortunately, most people in general public don't understand that, the genetics has a huge difference in how things are going to go for you. And then the drugs as well. And if you have someone with good genetics that piles on the drugs, guess what?
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
they can, they sniff glue and they gain muscular body weight.
Right.
It's not going to work for you. So there's complicating factors there, but the main thing is if you go in and you put in the work, you'll be able to see where there's problems in this smart boy stuff coming out, like the paper showing X, Y, and Z. And you're like, the paper is dumb. Why is it dumb? It's just
Yeah, it gives
there's
you
like 100 reasons I don't have all day. You know?
it gives you context. Absolutely. Well, I could think about something like RPE came to mind, right? So like the concept of RPE and the practice of implementing that into a program. If you're a guy and you're squatting 225, like you just don't have the experience of what a legitimately heavy squat does to you in terms of fatigue and the amount of stress it imparts and how you can recover from that over a reasonable window of time. If you can squat 455, you have a much better idea of how much stress you can impart in a workout and how that can affect everything else. And then you have, in the process of getting there to 455, you have run into problems in your training where the squat has interfered with something else and you had to figure that out. So it gave you context for that concept of RPE that you're never going to get unless you've actually solved that problem before. I think we run into this all the time with these. We see advanced athletes that have had to address these problems, talk about their training programs, and people who are far less advanced try to kind of work that back into their own program. It just doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that here's the overlap. So I shit on RPE every chance I get, and RIR, the new one. But when you look at like what some of these legitimately strong guys are doing when they're using RPE, is the net result is lighter weights are being lifted for sets. And we talk about doing that. We got our volume day, volume day, intensity day on Texas method. We talk about that. But we're using percentages. We're using objective load. And what I was going to say is, for those guys, when they're doing that, those light weights are hard because they're fatigued, and that's really what you're trying to create, right? Yeah. You're trying to get some work done when you're beat up from the fucking heavy set. But the end goal, especially competitive guys like, who was it that popularized RP? Was that Tashir?
That's who I think of. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, motherfucker, what's his best deadlift? Like 9 or something? He pulled over 9, right?
It's up there, at least 800. Yeah.
Either way, definitely 8, right? Yeah. So if that guy goes fucking heavy, he's going to have to lift quote unquote light weights, and we're going to define light as a percent of max, right? His percent of max is going to be lower than somebody who's fucking deadlifting 200, right? Well, actually, somebody who's deadlifting 200s on the LP, but I digress. But my point is, those light weights are tiring, and anybody who's made it to solid intermediate or advanced understands that when you have to take weight off to build up work so you don't detrain, you're going to use quote unquote light weights to build that up. Now, are you also going to be a pussy about it? And this feels right today. And no, let's not do that. That's not what we do here. Like, I know that tomorrow I got to squat 360 for 4 sets of 5. I don't want to fucking do it. If I put an RPE on that, I might do 315, Right. If I said, what? I just hit 410 for a set of 4.5 last week. So the next week I'm not going to be able to do that again. So I have to wait a couple weeks. So, I'm just going to do an RPE 7. Guess what? 410 will go for 0 next time because I'll do 275 next week,
Right.
Yeah.
So.
And there's a lot of context too, because if you're looking at something like RPE, for somebody who's like aggressive in their training, they're kind of using that to hold themselves back. But the general public is not aggressive in their training. So if you have like some guy that thinks he ought to be a little stronger, that thinks a 315-pound deadlift is a lot. And I'm like, if you're a 100-pound girl, it is. They have that kind of context. Those people end up, the actual reality, what happens on the grounds, those people use RPE to lift less and to get less done. So if you give it to the crazy guy, you're kind of like, just hold back, because you're going to kill yourself with your training. These other people are, you're like kicking them to try to get them to do anything. So it's a completely different, context there, right? That's one reason those things don't carry over. It's because, like, dude, you got to know who you're dealing with,
And the aggressive, crazy guy, you know, everything he's doing is centered around lifting a heavier load at some point. Whereas the other guy wants to completely make load an afterthought. That's two completely different situations. For one guy, it's all about load. And for the other guy, it's about evading load.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you give people a way to get out of something, kind of I was mentioning, I was talking about earlier about how people are dishonest in ways where they're not really trying to be dishonest. They're just trying to make something easier on themselves. It's kind of like that's how people act with dishonesty. RPE allows you to be dishonest with your training and with the stress you're doing, right? So you have an excuse to do less. People are lazy, horrible, biased, coming up with excuses for all sorts of things. This is a thing that allows them to do that. Does everyone do that way? No. But come on, you're dealing with people. Like
human nature.
Yeah. It's like you take something that aligns with human nature in a way that's going to give you a bad result. You already know what's going to happen here. It's like if you give me ice cream, what's going to happen? I'm going to eat the ice cream till it's gone.
That's right.
But don't bring it to my house, please.
Yeah, I think that's what I was drawn to when I first found Starting Strength, is that the process of doing the novice linear progression is, I mean, to me, a non-professional, non-educated person over here, it's science, right? Like there's a process of observation. So for first you have to do the training, right? So you do the training, you execute the program, and then there's observation that comes after that. Like, you learn a little bit about a stress recovery and adaptation, and that there's a window of time that it takes for you to recover and to adapt to the point where you can lift more weight. And it's very obvious in a novice linear progression because it more or less happens in a 48-hour window, but from workout to workout. And then eventually it breaks down, and you observe that happening. So you're sort of proving out these theories that you're reading about as you're doing the program. And so it's this iterative process, and that if you just pay attention to the patterns in your own training over the course of a few years, you learn a lot about how strength training works. You learn a lot about how programming works. And that to me that sounds like real science. That's like an actual scientific process right there. I mean, I guess there's not like a hypothesis, but maybe there is. I don't know. Maybe you can make it work, make the analogy work. But the point is, like, there is a lot that's demanded of your own experience executing the program, and then, like, what do your senses tell you? Like, hey, my back is completely fried. I couldn't break off a warm-up weight. I couldn't break it off the floor today. Okay, something's going on. And so you go back and you troubleshoot. It asks you, what are my senses telling me, rather than, like, what does some expert say that I should do with my training? How many sets and reps I should do? How should I progress it?
Yeah, you have to accumulate that training experience to really have that, and every situation is going to be different because, as we talked about earlier, human beings are very different. There's a lot of similarities, but this idea that we're mechanical robots that you can plug and chug a cookie cutter equation into and yield whatever outcome you're looking for, that's fantasy land. That's not how it works. The state of my advanced training is going to be different than Trent's, and it's going to be different than Stef's as well. And the way that I have to modify variables for that is going to be different. The further along the adaptation curve you go, the more individual it becomes.
Yeah, and the thing is, you're doing that on yourself. So all that learning you're doing as you train, you push into your limits, and they're in different places for different people. You'll find things that work for you. Just the other week at the seminar, we're talking about belts on the press, and most people really like belts on the press. I don't wear a belt on the press. I can't wear a belt on the press. It just messes me up. I don't do it.
No shit.
And see, I'm a person with a good press. I pressed over body weight. Not very many women have, and it's like, just thinking about putting a belt on makes me just not want to press. Just thinking about putting the belt on, because it interferes with my back position.
Sure.
But I tell people to put a belt on, right? So there's that's just things get more and more individual as you go along. And the way you recover from stress, what like just ruins you is going to be different from other people.
Mhm.
And you can't
Mhm.
just copy anybody.
And remember too, this belongs somewhere in our talk earlier of research, and certainly it's certainly important here. But when you're looking at studies on lifting, since that's what we're talking, that's what we do, lifting or diet, none of them control for lifestyle. 0% of them control for lifestyle.
Right.
So, that's the biggest variable, and that's the number one thing people are limited by.
Oh, it's
from coaching from a coaching
Huge.
perspective. The one I've coached probably thousands of people at this point, and I'd say lifestyle is the single greatest limiting factor in terms of training and diet progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just overall health, really, right? It's just it's like, well, what are you doing? And you can't.
That's literally the question. What are you doing? Can't answer that.
Yeah. You can't just change the little thing up here. It's everything you're doing, right? You have to look at that.
I can't answer that as a coach, and they can't answer it as a professional researcher. I don't know what the fuck they're doing. And they'll tell me one thing, they'll tell them the same line of bullshit, but they'll have a fancy form they haven't fill out. That's been validated. You just don't know. You can't control for lifestyle, and lifestyle is the single greatest limiting factor for not just this stuff, a lot of stuff. If somebody wants to go from point A to point B at anything, lifestyle is going to get in the way, unless that is their life, and that's something else, if this is what you do, then, you're going to do just fine. But if you're trying to improve an outcome in your life and get it above baseline, in the context of your lifestyle, then, you're going to have some challenges there. Things will go slower, less efficient, is what I've noticed.
Yeah, living proof over here right now. The last 2 years of my life. So I'm sitting here thinking like, okay, so we've shat all over the modern professional research. What is the scientific method good for? In what we do, does it have any place in health and fitness broadly? I think when I was talking about the programming problems earlier, one thing that I always cling to is the first principles that I know of, right? One of them being like stress recovery and adaptation. That is a very simplified model of how an actual human being responds to the stress of training in the gym. And then, of course, lifestyle has an enormous impact on the recovery part of that equation. But it does work. Like that is a thing that happens. Like stress is incurred in the gym, and recovery does take place over a period of time. And if those two factors are sufficient, we get adaptation. Like I see that happening all the time. I see when it breaks down all the time. So clearly, like there was somewhere a scientist figured that out, right? If we go back to Hans Selye's, who we usually credit for that basic model, the general adaptation syndrome, he had to figure that out. So I'm kind of wondering, like, where do you see the intersection? Like, where do you see science actually meaningfully contributing to what we do?
Okay, so here's the thing. What you just described was an engineering problem, not a science problem.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So what I mean by that is you're looking at what works and adjusting as you go on, but like the why isn't necessary. Like if it was eating Lucky Charms is what made you get your squat up, you know what I'm saying?
Right.
And that was the real reason behind your success. You didn't even need to know that. It's just like you just ate your breakfast and you squatted. So it just has to do with like, this is an applied deal.
Sure. Okay.
Where I think science helps, and of course this overlaps with engineering too, is what really helps when we're looking at our training and we're deciding what to do in the gym, we're evaluating how things are going, is having a systematic and analytical approach, right? Because it doesn't really matter if some of the things we think are wrong. If we're getting the job done, it doesn't really matter why we fly, right?
Yeah, sure. Right.
Right. You don't actually have to know why it works, when it's working, and when you're making progress. So I think just overall, the emphasis on science is a mistake. It's hubris, really. because we're so smart, we're doing it the magical way, the right way, because we understand everything, when the fact is we actually don't. Right?
Yeah. That's I like the way you put that, because that's the
Me too.
The longer that I do this, the less I really know about how things work. I was a lot more confident, 4 or 5 years ago about how all this stuff worked behind the scenes. Now I don't really know, but I have a process that I can go through to figure out how to solve problems and to get the weight on the bar going up.
To solve problems, like more like a mechanic than the professional researcher, right?
Right.
And I mean, all sorts of things that, there's, if you could just jump forward hundreds of years or whatever, there's going to be all sorts of things where you find out we're complete morons and everyone laughs at us because of what we did. I mean, maybe I can think about training, but just all sorts of dumb things modern people believe. You could look back and, laugh about something that people trusted in 1810. And you're like, you do understand that people are going to be laughing about you not too long in the future. Okay.
Right.
And not just about your ridiculous 80s hairstyle, right? They're going to be laughing about all sorts of things you believed, and you were such a retarded. Yeah. They're just going to be like, I can't believe people actually fell for that nonsense, and died because of it,
Right.
I can't believe that anyone ever ate Crisco, just all sorts of things.
Don't get me started. Yeah, well, although I feel like nowadays I look back with a lot more grace at old thinkers, and how they came to, so like if I'm looking at like a medieval physician that's like, well, we need to balance the humors. You don't want to have an excess of bile or whatever. But what they're really talking about when you take away their specific sort of like model that they have is, well, there has to be some sort of like balance in your life. Like you can't eat to excess, you can't eat, you can't fast to excess, you can't exercise to excess, you can't not exercise at all, which more or less makes sense. There's those things sort of, there's these truisms that you keep running into over and over that reveal themselves.
Right. Or, I mean, there, something taken to excess caused certain problems, but it did help other problems that were a problem, whether you're talking about bloodletting or whatever.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So, bloodletting is the stupidest thing ever. Hey, how many guys have to go in and donate blood because they have too many red blood cells? It's a pretty common thing, right? So, if you have hemochromatosis, it's like you have to dump that.
Yeah.
So it's like,
it's
like, maybe every other person, maybe if you just were bleeding out, let's not bleed you more. But, it's like there were benefits there, and they probably noticed certain benefits, and then maybe they took it too far and applied it too often or whatever the case was. But they weren't just crazy.
Yeah.
There was something behind it that made them think it was worth doing.
Yeah, I think that's I'm hopelessly into like Western civilization and like the beginnings of Western thought, and I've read very little of him, but I'm working on it. Uncle Aristotle is kind of the father of modern science as we understand it in the West, and most of the specifics that he came up with are probably wrong. How elephants communicate or whatever. I don't even know if he saw an elephant, but there's probably some specifics about all the fields of science that he touched on that are all wrong. But more or less, he believed that we have senses, and our senses give us fundamentally correct information about our environment. They don't lie to us in a categorical way. Like, we can be biased, but that's different from it. It's not totally false information. So we do have the instruments in ourselves to evaluate the world and observe and then draw conclusions about what we see. And I think that's a pretty powerful baseline. To your earlier point, I don't know that that's the philosophy that everyone ascribes to nowadays. I don't know if they truly believe that you can draw conclusions based on your own observations. Maybe because for some people, there is no truth to get to. There are no fundamental patterns to recognize.
Yeah, I think there's a disturbing. I mean, worse. I would say worse because they feed into each other, right? So it's hard to say what thing's worse when you have a problem or a series of problems. But I mean, so like relativism is a problem. It undermines all sorts of things, right?
Yeah.
But it seems now that people are getting to the point where they believe they can just make up reality, right? So it's not just I saw the event differently from you have, and my position's different from yours, and that's kind of like just like a difference of opinion because you saw a different
Right.
side of you're in a different place in the movie theater. It just looked different to you. But a more malicious thing where it's like actually like I'm inventing reality. It's like, well, we used to call people that did that crazy, but it seems like now we have to call them whatever they want.
Yeah.
Right. And I just see
Neurodivergent.
people. Yeah, I see people that they could just go along with it. So it's like, well, if someone's crazy, walk away. You get that bad feeling in your gut, leave.
Right.
Because
Right.
you know what's coming next. But it's like a reversion to this magical thinking of like how things are going to work. Like it's like, well, I'm a cat or whatever the deal is. It's like, well, yeah, for Halloween, right? And they're like, no, I'm really a cat. Like, no, you're really not.
Right.
So it's kind of it's like it's not reality's not real to people like that anymore.
Yeah. And I can only imagine that. I can only imagine you get to that state by not engaging in reality. Like I love the phrase, the Zoomers nowadays, they have this phrase and I love it. I steal it all the time. They say, touch grass. Like, hey, you need to go touch grass. Like you got to get out. You got to get out in the real world and experience some things because it teaches you these realities. It's fascinating to me. I have a toddler right now. And part of being a toddler is you gain all of these physical skills. Like every week, you're learning how to do something new physically, and you have all of this freedom to explore that you didn't have when you're just a baby and you can barely get around. And so, just like watching him go around the yard, we have a very weirdly sloped yard out here, so it's all sorts of like crevices and hills and rocks and stuff for him to climb over and run into. He learns a lot just by going out and experiencing things like, hey, that's a ledge. If you try to walk off of it, you're going to fall and it really hurts when you fall. Or like, that's really hard. If you run into that, that's going to hurt. This seems like just obvious things, but you have to learn that. And he's learning that through actual interaction with the world. If he never went out there, he would never learn these things. And he might draw all sorts of wild conclusions about how the world actually works that are totally different from the way it actually does.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's actually a huge problem. And there's people that live in such a artificially constructed life that they're not touching grass, as you say. They're not absorbing all sorts of things. And they're very susceptible to whatever's put in their head, right? Because they're not experiencing things for themselves and trusting their own experience. This ties back into like we were saying about like trusting the science or trusting the expert. It's like, well, what do you think? And there's a lot of people who seem to have lost just how they talk about things, right? You can tell they're like, well, so-and-so says, I read it on the internet this, and you're like, well, what do you think?
Right.
And they actually are in the point where they discount their own experience as secondary, as not as legitimate as something that could be entirely fabricated.
Right.
It's coming it's coming over the internet. It's like, well, like movies look real, and they're not real, right? So that whole thing could be faked, and they fake things. I mean, it could be like news, right? People they get caught staging things right and left. It's like, guys, and you just believe it? Why? They lied to you yesterday. Why are you listening to these people? Don't listen to liars.
Right. Right.
That cuts down on people you have to listen to quite a bit. But if I'm dealing with like, let's say, you're my next door neighbor and you bullshit me, right? You get a lot more feedback about the level of bullshit. If that's over, it's like, if you were like internet dating, you're not meeting the person, you know, they can lie about all sorts of things. If you're actually face to face, yes, they can fake it, but they'll slip up. It's easier to see the
Right.
problem. I had a guy I know, and he was telling me about, he had a bad experience. He went to pick up a girl. He'd been over the internet, all this stuff for some time, went to pick her up. And well, she wasn't 5'5". She wasn't white. She wasn't 125 pounds. She was enormous. She was this enormous girl. And he was like, I'm leaving. And she got really mad about it. And he was like, but everything you told me was completely made up.
Right.
To her, she thought he was like terrible because he didn't accept her, and it's just like,
what the fuck?
but that wasn't
right.
I don't know how you talk to someone like that. So he just left.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I don't know if you want to put that story in there, but I mean, he just left because it was like everything you told me was a lie. And she was like, but I like you. And he's like, but I'm leaving, you're crazy. Right. So I think people, it's like, guys, you got to get on the ground and actually interact with people, because you can be deceived so easily, much more easily, when you're not actually doing real things. Right.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard the term dry labbing? Have you ever heard the term?
No, I haven't heard that.
Never heard?
No, I have not.
Dry labbing. So, okay, imagine doing an experiment here, and I'm like, I have this, cell preparation here, and I'm putting chemicals on it. That's a wet lab. That's an actual experiment. Dry labbing is coming up with things in your mind on paper, right? So, I mean, that could just be like thinking of ideas, and that's fine. But if you actually decide how something's going to turn out, I'm just telling you, it doesn't work. It never works. So when somebody made up an experiment, with the euphemism for faking data is dry labbing. It's just dry labbed, or it's just fantasy. Yeah. He just made it up.
We've talked about here a lot. I borrowed this phrase from Santana. Does it pass the smell test? We talk about the smell test a lot, and
yes,
if somebody's talking about some concept about programming or exercise selection or whatever, whatever studies they pull out of their ass, at the end of the day, it has to pass the smell test of like, well, does this actually stand up to what we see coaching people every day? And it seems to me like the good products of professional research are the things that give us some insight into the why something happens, but then they also line up with our practical experience. It's like, oh yes, I've seen this phenomenon happen in my own sample size of the 300 people I've worked with, or whatever that number is. I've observed that phenomenon. I've observed that pattern. It lines up with what this research is telling me. That seems like that's that's a useful intersection of research and coaching.
Yeah, well, that's where you're actually like evaluating it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so like theoretical stuff, it's like, that's nice, but what really matters is what actually happens.
Sets of 30.
Yeah,
I like how I like how
I can really get to 3 without messing it up.
Yeah, the rep count keeps going up. What high reps are. It started with.
It used to be 15s, right?
Now we've gotten up to 30s.
30s are the new thing now. And oh yeah, but like just before I close out on this, what I've kind of figured out here is when they're talking about 20s and 30s and all that stupid shit, they're not fucking squatting and deadlift. They're not doing anything technical. They're on a fucking knee extension or a bicep curl or something that can be reproduced 30 times in a row, right? Squat can't be reproduced 30 times in a row. Deadlift cannot be reproduced 30 times in a fucking row. But then the broader concept that they're inferring is that what happens in one exercise needs to happen in all exercises. And I think that that's not addressed clearly a lot of times, both by people that are, selling that bullshit and by people arguing against it, right? Like, okay, 30s. Well, 30s on a fucking knee extension? Does that mean you need to do 30 squats though? Ask the right questions, how long is that going to work? Like you said, how are you going to measure that? Okay, you can't add load anymore, add sets. What are you going to do? 100 sets? Now you're doing cardio,
Right.
if you have the time to do that, So is it even a strength stimulus anymore? So you can't add sets forever. You can't add load forever on these things. I just think that, in terms of, how we talk about eventually, there's an asymptote. You reach your genetic limit, right? It takes longer to do that on an exercise like the squat. I think you hit that pretty fucking fast on an exercise like a cable curl,
Right.
And I think that's what we're talking about here, right?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
How long are you going to progress a knee extension? A few months, year. I mean, I don't know anybody who's silly enough to try and train that year after year, because the guys doing that, they cycle out the exercises too,
Mhm.
But, fuck, man. Yeah, I don't know. I think that, like, once you start getting into that shit, there's a lot of context that is lost there, So it's like kind of what you said earlier. It's not totally dishonest. It's misleading is probably the better word. Because, yeah, I would not want to do a set of 5 on a knee extension and throw out my knee, So, sure, 30s make sense. But then how long are you to progress the fucking thing,
Right. And how does something like that actually affect your overall performance, your strength, your health?
Exactly.
It's like,
Right.
we used to, this is like exercises, right? It's like,
Yeah.
great. Like, why are you doing that?
And it's like, what is hypertrophy? Okay, so they say that the cross-sectional area, the vastus medialis or the vastus lateralis. Sorry, they don't do the medialis because of the arteries. The cross-sectional area of the vastus lateralis, increased after 12 weeks of 10 sets of 10 knee extensions. Well, what the fuck does that mean? How much? Am I going to notice that? Are you going to notice that? If I'm the one that did it, like, how much are we talking about here? And is that going to continue? Because we know that as you continue applying a stimulus, you get less and less result from it, right? So, what magnitude are we talking about? A year of knee extensions versus a year of squats? Nobody's going to compare that for a lot of reasons, right? Nobody has,
Yeah, it's the old 25% of what kind of trick.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So hypertrophy, sarcoplasmic hypertrophy,
Yeah, I've arrived at the conclusion, for better or worse, that I don't need to read a scientific paper maybe ever again. But certainly,
Did you arrive at that just now?
well, no, I arrived at that a while ago, but
Okay.
yeah, I don't really see, if I can understand the attraction to the world of science for someone who has just an abounding interest in the world and wanting to actually like get in there and experiment with that. The process of like good scientific research is interesting to me. But yeah, from an actual application, so if you're listening and you're a coach, or if you're listening and you're just a lifter and you're interested in this stuff, yeah, I mean, I the literature is kind of the last place I think you need to be looking for information, for insight. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
Yeah, I would
would say
agree
so,
with
yeah.
that. It's kind of like one of these things that I'm just horrified when it happens. Like somebody will get in contact with me. Maybe it's, somebody in the prep course, maybe just someone online randomly, and they want me to look at some paper. And I'm just like, why are you torturing me? I don't want to see it. I don't want to look at it.
Please.
I just, why would you do this? I can think
Yeah.
of things that would be so much more fun, like, toothpicks shoved underneath my fingernails, and
Well,
dipping my body in nitric acid, and yet they come to me and they think because I have that, background that I want to do it. It's like, did you notice that I'm not doing that right now?
Right.
On a day-to-day basis, I'm not doing that right now.
yeah, sure.
Like, can you
sure.
give me something on chickens? I'm getting into chickens, and
Oh yeah.
if you give me something to read about chickens, I will read about chickens. Thank you.
Well, we'll talk offline more about chickens because yeah, we have chickens now. It's wonderful.
That's right.
Great little creatures. They taste good too.
Yeah, mine are
wife-
great. The border collie does not agree with that position.
Yeah, we've had some
So-
incidences with our dogs. We had to have some conversations, but I'll tell you what, roosters are man, they are pretty damn tough. Our rooster, we don't have him anymore. We had to give him away, but our rooster he took on 2 dog attacks like a champ, and I thought he was a goner. You know, he was getting shook around and everything. And when I finally got the dogs off of him, I put him in the hospital cage, just thinking like, well, because he was wheezing. I'm like, oh shit, like I think he's taking his last breaths right now. So I just put him in a little hospital cage that we have to separate birds when we need to, and gave him a little water.
Yeah.
And I came back, an hour later, and I'm like, that motherfucker is still ticking. And I come back a few hours later. I gave him a little food. I'm like, he's going to pull through. And then, sure enough, a week later, he's fine. Just had a few scars.
Bring it.
Yeah.
Bring it.
Now, he got a lot more aggressive after that. That's for sure. But but anyway, it's amazing. It's amazing what they can take, But that's his job, He took the hit for the flocks so that the hens didn't get it. But anyway, well, thank you, Steph, for taking some time to talk to us about this. I think it's interesting because a lot of people, if you're in the field and, or at least you have some like very tertiary experience with scientific research like I do. I don't have any, hands-on experience, but I have read a handful of papers, and I've been around a lot of smart people like y'all who have been in it. If you don't have that experience, I think it could be real easy to get sucked into the hole of like, well, but this science, this paper says, or this expert says. So it's good to see a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
You don't know.
Well, thanks for having me on. I can kind of wander about on the topic quite a bit. So
that's what we do here. We wander.
Okay.
Let's do it again. We'll find some paper or topic to some broad.
Yeah.
I like touching on broad topics that have a lot of papers behind them. I don't want to deconstruct a paper.
Well, no,
I'm not looking at papers.
The last episode,
I don't either. We're on the same page. I do not deconstruct papers here.
Yeah, there we go.
Chicken
papers.
Chickens.
Murray McMurray Hatchery magazine. We'll use that as our literature.
What did we say on the other episode?
Well, so on the last episode we did, like we really should have had you on the last episode because we did an episode all about training considerations for women. So we got 2 dudes over here, mansplaining. But yeah, I think that would be a more interesting topic to talk about because I know one of the things we talked about was I think people make this automatic assumption that just because you're training someone who's female, that training has to change, and that's in my experience that's not the case. Just because you're training a woman doesn't mean that she automatically has to do threes and has to have a different program and all that kind of stuff.
No, and you certainly wouldn't start out that way.
Right, exactly. So
the more athletic the person is, the less they're going to be like that,
Yeah.
So,
I invoked
but there's
you
always
on that one,
there's
I've heard you
always
say
weird
that before.
cases. So yeah.
Yeah. So maybe if we can get you back on in the future, we can talk about maybe some interesting experiences you've had training other people.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't trust you guys anymore. There's that slight talk about making me look at a paper, and I'm feeling a little bit like no.
I wouldn't.
He said it, not me.
I would.
All right.
What I meant to say is we pick a topic that people like to cite and shit on that.
There we go.
Okay.
Like bench pressing on a stability ball.
Yeah. I don't mind telling other people they're stupid.
Yeah.
I can be very direct. Like, that's stupid.
That's the fun part.
Well, yeah, that's why I don't wear wrist wraps. They're like, why are you wearing wrist wraps? They're fucking gay. And I took them off.
I'm not a fan of wrist wraps. 99% of people do not need them, and they shouldn't be wearing them, and it bugs me. My wrist. Wait, they're small. I have little wrists.
Yeah.
No wrist wraps.
Yeah. Can you read this paper on wrist wraps?
No.
All right. Well, you want to close this out, sir?
Sure thing. Thank you for tuning in to the Weights and Plates podcast. You can find me at weightsandplates.com, on Instagram at @the_Robert_Santana. Or if you're in Metro Phoenix, come by Weights and Plates Gym. We're just south of the airport. We have private training, gym memberships, and really good equipment. Go ahead, Trent.
All right. Well, hey, you know where to find me. I'm on Instagram at marmalade_cream. That's also the name of my audio production company. So if you have a podcast that you need to be produced or that you want to start, I'm the guy to talk to. Send me an email, trent@marmaladecream.com. And Stef, how can we find you if we want to find you, or can we find you?
Yeah, I can be found. Stef at startingstrength.com is the best way to get in touch with me.
All right, excellent. And you know, if
But
you're
no papers.
yeah, no papers, please do not send her papers. Yeah, we're gonna have to hold her back from committing federal crimes if you send her papers. Mm-hmm. All right, we'll talk to you all again in a couple of weeks.